Neil sat at the back of the train and settled into his seat. As they rolled out of the station, he attempted to gather his thoughts. He hadn't had any real time off work in almost a year, and now here he was with 10 days to play with. He had formally been planning this trip for several weeks, but in his mind this journey, this return, had been years in the making. Neil had left the island almost 12 years ago after failing his A-levels, and had not returned since. This didn't bother him at the time, as he had no intention of going on to university. With a heavy heart, he had jumped on a ferry to the mainland in search of work. He found a cold and impersonal world. He struggled with his anger and a growing sense of resentment as he travelled from town to city to town around England, working in low-paid factory and kitchen jobs. In his school days, he was outgoing and full of the joys of life, but more than a decade outside of the pleasant bubble he was raised in had turned Neil into a more callous character. He had a seasoned contempt for urban dwellers, but he hadn't entirely lost his sense of humour. He could see the funny side of his misfortunes in the big wide world. Neil had been living with his latest girlfriend for a few weeks, and he didn't really care for her as such. She was good at fucking and complaining and not much else as he saw it. He had told her that he was going to visit his parents up in Newcastle, where they had moved to some years before. She suspected he was lying but didn't really care. As long as she could stay at his place rent-free, she was happy enough. The only other family Neil had was his sister June, who, like his parents, had long since moved away from the island to Galway Bay and started a family and a new life of her own. Why was Neil Potter, a 30-year-old man with a chip on his shoulders and many bitter experiences still fresh in his mind, now returning to the island of his youth? Was he hoping to recapture the energy and zest that had somehow slipped away over time? The answer was a resounding yes. He also wanted to see some old faces and hear some old stories. He was curious, of course. What had become of the old gang and the community in general? He was heading home, and he was at the same time escaping. Visions of his old hangouts flashed in front of him as he sat there waiting for the final destination to be called. From the train, it would be a short walk to the ferry. Then once aboard, it would be less than an hour at sea before he could set foot once more on the green grass of home. As he departed the train, he could feel his heart race a little. After a coffee and a smoke, he felt even more energized. By the time Neil got on the ferry, he was truly excited, as if his inner child was now taking over his thought processes. He went up on deck and looked around, but couldn't see any old faces among the small number of passengers. Eventually, he was able to see the island emerge on the horizon. At first, it appeared as a black rock, but as they moved closer, its natural features became more apparent. For the first time in a long time, Neil Potter felt at peace with himself. He was exactly where he wanted to be. As they arrived at port, Neil took his time to gather his belongings and his emotions. As he took his first steps on home soil, a strange awareness took hold. Was this a spiritual moment he was having? He surrendered to the experience as he slowly walked towards the White Rock guest house. The White Rock was at the far southern tip of the island, about 2 miles from the port at the north end. Neil could have taken a taxi, but he was in no rush. Besides, he wanted to take in the sights and smells of the old place. The island had no towns. There were 2 villages, one in the north and the other in the south, and 2 fairly large farms run by members of the same family. At least that was how it was when Neil was a kid. The island had a small doctor's surgery, a fire station, a small police station, a coast guard, a primary and secondary school as part of the same building, An Anglican church, a pub, a small selection of shops in both north and south villages, and council premises located at the top of the island's only real hill to speak of, Angel Hill. It had acquired its name on account of a story involving a suicidal woman who had gone up the hill to hang herself but was visited by a messenger of the Lord in her hour of need and comforted, and so she turned back and decided to dedicate the rest of her life to church service. The validity of this tale is widely disputed. Neil took in the North Village, which to his eye hadn't changed a great deal. He went into the convenience store to buy some cigarettes and beer. A young man who he did not recognize stood behind the counter serving. Sat on a stool nearby reading a newspaper was a middle-aged Indian man who Neil remembered as a younger fellow. All the kids used to call him Jazz back in the day. He used to chase troublemakers away, brandishing a broom handle. Neil remembered him as a big man who could move quickly when the mood took him. Now he looked old and tired, his hair almost entirely grey, and his eyes sunken and a little bloodshot. Neil carried onward until he reached the school, where he took his bag off his shoulders and decided he needed a little sit down and a smoke. He sat on the wall on the opposite side of the road to the building, looking at the gate of the primary school entrance. The kids would be in class now, as it was about midday. He stared at that gate as he played out a strong memory. A pupil called Joe had arrived just after Christmas, in what would have been the last year of primary school for Neil's class. This Joe had immediately started throwing his considerable weight around, and had let it be known that he was the new playground boss. One day during lunch break, Joe had charged at a group of boys who he thought were making fat jokes at his expense. In his fear, Neil grabbed Joe's jumper, ripping it almost in half. Joe flew into a rage and chased Neil around until a teacher intervened and calmed things down. The very same day, Joe, who had been in tears earlier, was waiting outside the gate for Neil. In a fair fight, Neil wouldn't have stood a chance. He was a skinny little thing until a growth spurt kicked in at around 15 or 16. But this was to be no fair fight. Neil's best friend at school was Nathan Bates. Nathan was a troubled young fellow who was great at getting into trouble and not much else. He came from a broken home, with his mother on her own raising 4 youngsters on welfare. Nathan, as the eldest, was allowed to get away with quite a lot. He was a wild child in and out of school. On this day, he went too far. Seeing that his friend was about to be battered by this bloated newcomer, Nathan decided to intervene. Joe squared up to Neil and informed him that he was dead meat. Nathan moved forward from the small crowd that had gathered, and with no hesitation threw a vicious punch directly into Joe's throat, causing him to collapse to the pavement in a heap. Nathan then proceeded to stamp on Joe's head and chest as the fallen boy gasped for air. Several children ran from the scene in horror to get a teacher. Others stood transfixed. The PE teacher, Mr. Rollins, swiftly came to drag Nathan away as other staff emerged to help Joe, who was in a bad way. Joe was not seen again, as his parents were so sickened by the incident that they pulled their son out of school and home tutored him for several months before leaving the island for London in the summer. Nathan was suspended. He wasn't seen in the classroom again until after high school had started. At age 14, he was expelled for punching a teacher, thus ending his formal education. It had started to lightly rain by the time Neil reached the guest house. The White Rock was a small establishment catering for the odd wandering tourist or family staying on the island. Neil had never actually been inside before, so this was a new experience. No one was at the check-in counter, so he rang the bell. A lady emerged and said, "Neil Potter?" "That's right," came the reply. He didn't identify her straight away. She went through the formalities and led him to his room. Before handing him his keys, she asked, "What brings you back here then, Potts?" Neil smiled as the penny dropped. It was Fiona Francis. She was one of the goth girls, as he recalled. They hung out a little as teenagers as part of a dirty half-dozen, so to speak. Now stood before Mr. Potter was a beautiful, formally dressed woman. No heavy makeup, but still the same short black hair. They talked for about 10 minutes. Fiona seemed visibly sad as Neil told her of his troubles. He learned that she had lived in Paris for quite a while, but had returned 2 years ago with her French girlfriend, having become tired of the city. She had done well for herself, working in sales, and was now part owner of this establishment. She suggested that they should go for a drink at some point. Neil made it clear he was warm to this idea. She left him to settle in. Neil's mind was swimming with a soup of emotions. He hit the shower and then made a start on the beers. He would rest up for a couple of hours and then he would head out. He would stick to his plan. Neil sat on the bench inside the old cemetery with his eyes closed. It was a warm evening with a little breeze. 15 years ago, almost in the very spot he now occupied, he had had his first sexual experience with a girl called Lucy Quigley. As he remembered, there was a group of 6 of them, 3 lads and 3 girls. They had been drinking cider and causing trouble in the village earlier that night. It was an eventful night for Neil. Firstly, he had been threatened by a shopkeeper for shouting obscenities in the street. The guy had actually threatened to kick his head in if he didn't shut up. The fear and excitement this caused had stayed with him into adulthood. Maybe an hour or so later, he called his dad from a phone box and told him that he was staying out longer than his curfew. His old man ordered him home in no uncertain terms, but the young Neil wasn't having any of it. It must have been close to midnight when he had his way with Miss Quigley, and soon after he said good night to his mates and kissed Lucy goodbye. He started the slow walk home, but didn't get far before his dad pulled up in his old banger and sternly told him to get in. He didn't say anything on the way back. It wasn't until they got out of the vehicle on the Potter family driveway that he told Neil to go into the kitchen where his mother was waiting. Neil could not recall what came first, the shouting or the smacks upside the head. He could recall her final words that night, though. She said, "Get up those stairs. I'm sick of the bloody sight here." All these years later, and those words were still burned into his brain. She said it with such disdain, which was unusual for her. Perhaps that's why they stuck. He probably slept for about an hour that night. The events of the evening were all too much for him. The next day at school was simply a blur. Not much had changed with the old Anglican church. It was much the same place as it had been in his youth, but it seemed somehow smaller now. Neil rose to his feet and stretched. It was time to head to the Forester's Arms. When he reached the pub, he took a moment to take in the front entrance. Clearly, it had had an external makeover since his last visit as a teenager. He went inside carrying a couple of butterflies in his guts. It looked like a quiet night. A woman stood behind the bar. She looked at Neil in a questioning way. A fair way over to his left, 2 young men were playing pool. They didn't clock Neil. To his right, nearby, a middle-aged man sat on a stool. He gave Neil a nervous sideways glance before looking down again at his pint. Neil politely ordered a bottle of Dutch lager and sat down, noticing now for the first time that day that he was getting tired. As the lady served his drink with a smile, it registered who was now standing in front of him. It was Barbara Greasley. He knew her as a girl from the year above him in school, who was regarded as something of a pin-up by the lads in his class. She had been a beautiful girl, and she was still an attractive lady, but her face looked worn. The eyes had lost their sparkle somehow. Neil wasn't sure if she recognised him, and as he was drinking his lager, he could feel the growing urge to speak up. When he was ready to reorder, he would reintroduce himself, he decided. But before he could, the middle-aged man shuffled up next to him and extended his hand to Neil. "How's it going, young fella? My name's Max. Pleased to meet you, sir. Pleased to make your acquaintance. I regret to tell you that I'm not having the best of days. Me and me lady friend have been having problems, you see, sir. In fact, I haven't slept in 3 days, truth be told." Neil nodded his head and maintained eye contact as the man, who looked like an old-school biker, told his rambling story. The guy was obviously intoxicated, but he wasn't too far gone just yet. Barbara interrupted and asked them both if they'd like another drink. Neil took this opportunity to spit out the words bouncing around his head. "It's Barbara, isn't it? I think we went to school together." She smiled again and took a good look at him before saying, "My memory ain't what it used to be, love. What's your name?" Neil responded, and then mentioned that he used to knock about with Nathan. Barbara opened her mouth wide before relaxing her face into a half smile. Then she let out a little chuckle. She did remember him. "Wow, you did some growing up, Potts. That's what your mates used to call you, right?" They started to talk about old times, which sort of isolated the middle-aged biker-looking chap. Neil learned that Barbara had never left the island, and had 2 children, both boys, with a man called Chris, who bought the Forester's Arms 7 years ago. So, she was the landlady of this fine establishment. Barbara was the people-pleaser type, very easy to get on with, kind of an open book. Neil ordered lager after another, and asked questions about old schoolmates into the night. Barbara was more than happy to tell him what she knew. Neil learned that many of his former peers had left for the mainland, as he himself had. This didn't surprise him. This was a small community which could only support a certain number of folks. He was interested to learn that a lad he went to school with named Adam was now the local priest. Neil recalled that he was a shy kid who was more focused on his musical pursuits than classwork. He also found out that a girl he was fond of in school, Claire Wise, was now a teacher in the primary school, in charge of the youngest children. Barbara informed him that Claire was likely to be in the pub tomorrow night, and suggested he should come say hello. He was visibly pleased to hear this, and enthusiastically nodded his head. Eventually the subject of Nathan came up. Barbara seemed a bit surprised that Neil had had no contact with him in all these years. Nathan still lived on the island with his mother Mary. Apparently he would disappear for weeks at a time, presumably he would go to the mainland, only to return looking worse than when he left. The landlady also informed him that Nathan had spent some time behind bars, but she didn't go into specifics. Neil remarked that Nathan was a troubled soul back in the day, and that he was disappointed to hear that he had done time at Her Majesty's pleasure. Neil felt guilty to a certain degree that he hadn't made any contact with Nathan in all these years, but that was just the way life had turned out. When Neil finally left the pub, it was late. His legs felt weary as he made his way back to the guest house. The energy that had animated him earlier seemed to have abandoned him, and he was now ready for a long sleep. Back at the White Rock, Neil stood in front of the bathroom mirror, doing his oral hygiene routine. His mind was just about ready to shut down. He could not focus on any particular thoughts. When he sat down on the bed to take his shoes off, it hit him. He was seriously drunk. He began to softly laugh to himself as he disrobed. Almost as soon as his head hit the pillow, he was out.